Welcome to Tel Hatzor. This is a special place in my life because I spent 2 dig seasons here, and so when I'm walking up, it just brings back a lot of great memories. But you're sitting in an area that's very special to the place. You notice they have put in a lot of money to preserve this from the weather. It's the only palace like this of this size in all of Israel. What you're seeing and where you are, you're on the Acropolis, you're on the upper Tel of Hatzor. Up here is where the kings would be, the most religious, the most prominent people would be, and they would stay up on this area. Hatzor was began as a dig in the early 50s, mid 50s, by a man named Yigiel Yadin. Yadin was a general, I believe, in the Israeli army. He fought here, and after his service time, he chose to go into archaeology. Brilliant man. He dug here. He dug at several other places, but most noticeably Masada. He was there as well. So you'll see Masada when we get there. But he began in 1955. Hey, I'm not that old, okay? I wasn't here in 1955. But he began to dig, and when you dig, if you notice how all the thistle and the grass and stuff grow over these sites, you don't know what's here. But they knew that this location was something special when they started to dig here. Later on, they found some clay tablets that had the name Hatzor on them from this site. And they're certain that this is Tel Hatzor. It has been verified several times over. As I told you earlier, the reason we stopped here is because this site is missed too much, okay? Too often, this site, this location is not even covered on tours. And it's so important, though, for the nation of Israel, for the early part of our Bible. It's very important because of a couple of different things, several different things. Number one is sheer size. I don't think there's another Tel in all of Israel that is this large. We don't cover any city that's this large. You say even Jerusalem, Back in those days, Jerusalem, even beyond Solomonic Jerusalem, up until the time of Jesus, there was no city as big as this in all of Israel. This is a massive city. This upper Tel is about 25 acres. The lower Tel, the lower city, is about 175 acres. So this is a massive place. The road that we came in on, you could see the Tel sticking up as a big hill in front of you. The road curves around it going north. Farmers who, as you go to the left, you'll see the city unfold down there, but farmers on the other side of the road have found out in the fields out there, they found these clay pipes running all through the fields. These clay pipes were, some of them 1 meter, 2 meters long, and they had holes in them. Any idea what that might be? Irrigation, drainage from the city. And so this city was the metropolis of the early part of the Bible, of the north. Hatzor identified mostly with the north, with Syria and those Mari and Nuzi, those big cities up to the north. It identified with them more than it did the south, more than it did with Egypt. But there are certainly Egyptian connections here. The Bible, where we come across Hatzor as we read the Bible, is in Joshua chapter 11. Joshua chapter 11 says this, and Joshua destroyed Hatzor, and Hatzor was the head of all those kingdoms. So all these kingdoms up here, Hatzor was the head. It was the chief city of all those places, right? So this is a very significant place. And so I'm going to tell you about this place and about some of the archaeology of it. But I wanted to begin kind of giving you a setting and tell you a little bit about archaeology. Have any of you studied archaeology at all? Okay, you have. Bill has. Others? Okay. Indiana Jones, that has nothing to do with archaeology. Honestly, it does not. If you see anybody on a white horse riding around, say that's not an archaeologist, okay? Because that's not archaeology. Archaeology is sweat. I mean, when I was coming up the hill here at Hatzor, I told my wife and those around me, I've spent many a day riding the bus, climbing that hill at 4:45 in the morning, dreading the day because it was going to be hot. Now, we were in some shade. We had those shading tents and stuff. We were in that. But you work in the dirt. You're on your knees in the ground, and you dig. You just dig. And so it's just hot. It's sweaty. It's even boring sometimes. Okay, you've got a petition in your hand about this long. It looks like a masonry hammer. Okay, to those of us in America, it looks like a masonry hammer, and you're just basically digging, and you're trying to dig a layer this deep all the way around your square. And sometimes you'll dig the whole layer, you get all the dirt scooped up, and you found nothing. And then you'll do it again, and it's every day. But there's some days when you're doing that, you operate in this 10 by 10 square, right? And you're in this square and you're digging, and all of a sudden you'll hear a tick. Could be something. And so you dig around it, and there's a piece of pottery that existed back in the time of Joshua. Now, it may not be archaeologically significant, but for a man like me who doesn't know much about history, to uncover something that's 3,000 years old, even though it's not archaeologically significant, it's personally significant, right? And so those kind of things keep you going each day. Archaeology starts from the top down, okay? So it starts with the most modern times and works its way into the past. Does that make sense? So the higher up in the ground it is, the younger it is. When we talk about a tell, you could see this. Did you notice how it was on a hill? Well, this is an artificial hill. Now, there may have been some sort of a rise here. We don't really know for certain, but maybe in a small rise. But whoever settled this first knew that there's a spring right across the road down here. There was a water source. They also came up on this hill and they looked and they could see miles and miles that way. They could see miles and miles that way. They could see miles and miles to the north. And they looked and they're defended by this great ridge right here. Do you see how difficult it would be to bring an army of thousands over that ridge there? You're not going to be caught off guard. Anybody coming up in all of this valley of any significance, you're going to see them coming. So the person, whoever settled this town first, knew they had water, they had a defensible position. And so they set up a town here. They set up a little community, and it began to grow and grow and grow because of a great location. So that city, let's say that city back in ancient times, that city got wiped out. Let's say disease came through, and that 5,000 people died, or they moved off because they were scared. Those buildings were left, wind blows, and dirt comes in, and decay, and all sorts of stuff happens. New people come in, they see the water source down there, they stand on the hill and say, this would make a great city. And the process happens again. They say, oh, there's some buildings here, we'll cover them up. Hey, we can use that wall, but we'll cover up the rest of it with dirt. And they didn't have bulldozers, but they'd bring dirt in, they would level off, and they would start again. Now, you do that over time, over a period of thousands of years, and you'll all of a sudden have this hill starting to build, right? And that's called a tell. It's almost like a layer cake. Okay, if you think about a cake with all kinds of layers, and if you take that cake and you were to cut it down the middle, you would be able to see all the different layers. Archaeologically speaking, those layers are called strata. Stratigraphy is the study of the strata, the different layers of occupation. And what you have to do as an archaeologist is try to figure out which strata of the city goes with each part. If you'll notice, we're at the high point here. We're at the high place of this hill. The hill runs off. Okay, and all in history, there has been a slope on this. So there's like a layer cake where it's all level like this. And on an archaeological dig, the layers go like this and they undulate. So the trick is to find out how these layers work together all throughout this area. And so you do it by pottery, you do it by different things. If you find anything in writing, that helps significantly because you can study the different types of writing, you can study the language and so forth. So here we are on the dig, and you're beginning to see and understand as they went down. When we started here at Hot Sore, the level was way above these walls that are around you, okay? This used to be the ground that we stood on and dug downward. So this particular palace that you're in came from the pre-Israelite period, the Canaanite period. This existed a long, long time ago. Probably this thing existed up to something like 1200 BC. And so this palace is huge, and so you can just imagine we working down, and the first person came across, I was here when they started uncovering these orthostats, these basalt stones. These are volcanic rock, and if you'll notice, this entire palace is lined with those. They became the foundation. Hot Sore loved those basalt stones. And so they would build that there, and you'll notice right above that, that's mud brick. Please don't touch the mud brick, okay, because your skin oil and they're very fragile. Just try not to touch those. But you can see that's made out of mud. There would then, above them, would be a roof made out of wood of some sort across the top. They had a wood floor, much like you've got here, and wood across the top. over time, those deteriorate. So you can't do much with that, but you have to date the stratigraphy, not by the wood, but typically by the pottery that's there. You say, how can you date pottery? Well, let me ask you this. How many of you know the modulation and the change of Coca-Cola bottles? Okay? Now you think about an old Coca-Cola bottle from the 1950s. It had a distinct look and a feel. The glass was heavy, right? You come to the 60s, it began to change. You come to the 70s, it was even changing. And all through those times, the Coca-Cola bottle changed. So if you were digging in the dirt and you found a Coca-Cola bottle, you could find a date because you know there's a sequence of Coca-Cola bottles, how they sequence themselves. In pottery, it's very similar. Now, I'm simplifying this greatly, okay? But I want you to understand there's a sequencing in pottery. The way they shape the rims, the material that the pottery is made of, the kind of handles. And the ladies back then, they loved decoration too, okay? And so they would decorate their pottery. They would have all sorts. The potters, they would want them to decorate it. They would paint them differently. And so that sequencing of how pottery developed from more simple to more refined helps us understand the dating. And then if you find amongst this group of pottery, let's say you find something that has writing on it, then all of a sudden that pottery, you can date that writing, and that pottery that's right around it immediately in that same layer came from that time period. Does that make sense? That's called relative dating. You peg this date based on something that's known. And you peg this date based on that date, which was based on something that's known. And so it's called relative dating. And so the pottery systems that you can learn and you can date are pretty accurate. And so they do that through pottery. Now, that tells you a little bit about archaeology. I wanted you to kind of understand how archaeology works from the top down. Also, it's a destructive science. There's no way to put back things like it was. When you dig, you're destroying it. So they make sure they're very, very meticulous. This is very scientific. When they begin a tell, they have surveyors come out and they survey this tell and they lay it out in 10 by 10 grids, okay, on paper. They lay it out in a survey. Every grid gets a number. Most of them have an alphanumeric tag on it. This up here is area A. Up near the Acropolis is area B. We're going to go see where area M was. They opened up area C way down on the lower end of the city, toward the city, area H down there. There are all sorts of these areas, and they got A, B, C, D, E, F, whatever. I think there's through H at Hot Sore, maybe more than that. And then inside of area H, they block off an area, and those squares get a number, A1, A2, A3, A4, A5. And so that square would be A1. And then you have a layer. Your first level, I'm going to be simplistic, was A11. You get that level done, taken care of, A12, A13, right? And so every layer gets its own, it's called a locus, a location. Every layer gets a number and it gets a tag. Everything has a tag on it. And so they're writing all this down. There's people in every square. There's supervisors who take care of all the areas, and there's people in all the squares who supervise those squares, and they write everything down. So you begin the day with a fresh bucket, fresh pail that has nothing in it except it has a tag on it. And it'll say A1 245 or something like that, or A2063. It has a number on it, your bucket. And so every piece of pottery you gather that day goes in that bucket. Also during the day, there's people coming around making photographs constantly. Everything's tagged on the walls. Everything's written down. The buckets are tagged. The pottery in that bucket's tagged. And when you get back to the hotel, to the place you're staying, the dig site, all the workers are staying there. You would take those tags and they get transcribed, written in a record book. So everything has a record. Also, there's architects here, there's drawers, and people are drawing. They'll draw this. I'll guarantee you, if you talk to Dr. Bentor or Sharon Zuckerman, you would see there's drawings of every layer of this palace right here. Somebody will be here drawing every brick. And so it's very scientific. It's very meticulous. So it's not Indiana Jones, right? I mean, you think about it. Okay, I'm the person who writes everything down. Okay, where's my white horse, right? I'm the worker who's on his knees. You know, my job, I was one of the hired hands, and actually wasn't even hired. I was paying to be here, you know, and I was on my knees every day digging, right? I didn't have a white horse anywhere or a leather jacket or anything. And Dr. Bentor, Amnon Bentor, who's the dig director from the 90s forward, he never came in on a white horse. It's not Indiana Jones. But let me tell you some things that we've discovered here that's exciting. You know a little bit now about archaeology, and tell you about some exciting things. When we were digging, when I got here already, they knew that this palace existed. They just couldn't get there, right? They were having to come down the layers, and you know something exists, and you know it's there, but you just got to go through. You've got to go through very meticulously and go through each layer. And so when I got here, we were just beginning to see these brick walls. They were on the floor, actually. You could see the layout. You knew it was brick, mud brick, and you could kind of see the layout, but you didn't know what was under it. The second season I was here, they had already gotten down to the tops or so of these orthostats, these foundation stones that line this area. So that second dig season, they came from those things all the way down to what you see as the floor right now in this palace. I was here when they uncovered those big basalt pillar bases out here. That courtyard, that podium, we uncovered all that while I was here. I can't take credit for it. I was just a part of it. It was just great fun to dig and see those things, you know. One of the ladies that you're going to see on the video when we go down to the Jesus boat, her name is Orna Cohen. She helped preserve the Jesus boat. She's the one that helped concoct the solution there. So, due to some series of events in her life, she was at Hot Sore that summer. She didn't really want to be here, she told me, but the way things, I don't want to share a lot of her personal life that she told me, but due to some things, she was here, okay? She was assigned to Hot Sore that summer. So all these steps, these basalt steps and things, the pillar bases, the black pillar bases out there, she was a conservator, and so she was trying to teach us how to conserve those and these mud brick walls. And so I worked with Orna for a couple of weeks trying to work with some of these things. And so I want to tell you a little bit about this palace. This palace dates back to pre-Joshua days, right? This palace was here during the time when Joshua came forward and when he destroyed Hatzor, which was the king, the head of all those kingdoms. So when Joshua came, you're in this palace where Joshua was, where Joshua's people came in and destroyed this palace. When we got down to the floor right here, to this level, there was a debris layer of ashes. I mean, you could tell there was nothing but ashes and dirt, and it was probably about that deep. It was amazing how deep it is. If you look closely at some of these places, you can see the grayish, the very dark gray dirt. Those are ashes. This palace, having the wood floor, the wood beams, and having wood in the wall like that, would be very flammable. You feel the breeze is blowing right now? In this palace also, they had some humongous oil jars. They're called pithoi. A pithos is a big oil jar. Some of them are bigger than you can put your arms around. Most of them are maybe this big around. And have you ever seen those little telescoping cups that you can pull out and you can drink water out and then press it back down? When we started digging this area and this area was being uncovered, there were, I don't know how many pithoi were here, but I saw at least 10 to 15 of them that were squished flat, just telescoped down. Now those were full of oil. When they set the city on fire, this area on fire, the wood from the roof, the wood from the floors caught on fire, and you can imagine how it would just intertwine itself. It can get plenty of oxygen. Those timbers from the roof fell down, crushed those jars straight down. The oil caught on fire, and the flame up here was humongous. Orna told me, I said, Orna, what kind of temperatures are we talking about here? And she said to me, just in a personal conversation, she said probably 17 to 1800 degrees. I said, well, how much is just a typical fire? She said around 900 degrees. So basically, the winds worked as a bellows, right? Or bellows, and it blew this stuff, and the wood and the oil, and this was a massive fire. The fire was so hot, you can read it in Biblical Archaeology Review this past year, maybe in the fall, there was an article about this. But you can picture this fire so hot that it actually melted the mud bricks. It actually melted the pottery. It was so hot that it began to crack a lot of this. You see a lot of these foundation stones are cracked. That had to do with the heat of the fire was just so tremendous. And the Bible says that Hatzor, Jericho, and Ai are the three cities that were destroyed when the Canaanites, Joshua, and they came forward. In recent times, I'm going to conclude with this. In recent times, there's been this push toward what is now known as minimalism. A group of scholars in the 1970s, due to several other events, I'll talk to you more about that at Dan, but through several other events, these scholars were saying that the Bible had no history before Ahab. He was the great builder, right? And so Solomon didn't exist as we think about him in the Bible. He existed maybe, but he was down in Jerusalem at that small little place. David didn't exist. They were saying because we have no extra biblical writings about David, there's no way a man like that could exist. If the Bible talks about David, nah, it didn't happen. If David didn't happen, then Gideon probably didn't happen. Gideon didn't happen. Joshua probably didn't happen. Joshua didn't happen. Moses probably didn't happen historically. And if Moses didn't happen historically, then Abraham probably didn't exist as a human being. That the Bible was what's called etiological. It was written way after the fact to give credence to the present. Okay? In other words, that when Israel left Babylon, now Babylon is that way, okay? And it's a long way over there. But they would have to travel up through here and around the Fertile Crescent to get to Babylon. And as they came back in around 520 BC, which is a long time after Joshua, but as they came back from Babylon, you know the story of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that they needed a place to settle in Jerusalem. Everything had been demolished. They'd been in exile for 70 years. And in order to give those people a national identity and a national heart and a love for Judaism and a love for home, that these people, this group of intellectual scholars, these elites, wrote what we think of as the historical books of the Bible. That's minimalism. That it may have had some historical nugget, it may have had a little bit truth to it, but maybe not. And so minimalists were rising up during that time in the 70s. And so to come to Hatzor and to dig and to see this was very significant. Now, Dr. Ben-Tor, Amnon, he likes to call you Amnon, but I feel disrespectful when I call him that. But Amnon was here, and he came up with this theory, and I really like this theory. He's a very logical man. He's not an Orthodox Jew at all. He's Israeli. He grew up in the Hebrew University. That's where he learned under Yigiel Yadin, who was the first one here. And he came back in the 90s, and he's been digging here. And Dr. Ben-Tor came up with this very logical. I mean, it's just so logical. I'm a man from Sand Mountain, Alabama. Okay, we're just normal people. Plain talk is easily understood. We talk plain. We don't mean anything by it. That's just the way we are. We talk in simple terms. Dr. Ben-Tor was that way when he's talking about who destroyed Hatzor. If Joshua didn't exist in the Israelite conquest, we call it the conquest, if that really didn't happen historically, then you've got to have an answer. You can't just say, that didn't happen. We see it happen. If you look in this corner, I just now noticed, look back in that corner. You saw that black in there? That's from fire. Because we know that this place was burned with fire. And so you can say, well, the Israelites didn't do that. That's fine, but somebody did. Okay? So the answer is, who did? You can't just say, well, it didn't happen. It did happen. So what is the answer to who did this? So Dr. Ben-Tor says this. Well, let's take a look at the evidence at Hatzor, just strictly from this site, this place. He said there's only about 4 or 5 people groups that were big enough to destroy a metropolis like this. Picture in your mind New York City. Okay, there couldn't... Whitesboro, Alabama, the place where Alan Hallmark and I grew up. Whitesboro, Alabama has a few hundred people in the community, right? And it's a community. We don't even have a stoplight. We don't even have anything. We're country, right? Small. There's nothing in Whitesboro, Alabama that we could take to New York City and conquer New York City. Okay, that makes sense? In the state of Alabama, I don't think the state of Alabama has enough National Guard that we could take all of them to New York City and conquer New York City. You understand the logic there, right? So there's only a certain group of people available in the world at that time who could conquer a city such as this. Okay, you wouldn't get that little community over there, come over here and conquer this town. Even at its height, this place had 240,000 inhabitants. So even at its lowest, it probably had 100,000 people here. Who's going to destroy that? So you only have a few options. You got Egypt in the south. Egypt is very powerful. You got Syria in the north, and they're kind of non-existent. They're in a people vacuum. Who else we got? Well, the Babylonians, they're embroiled in all kind of they hadn't existed yet, but those people over in that way in Babylon, they're embroiled in all kind of internal turmoil. They're just not worried about Palestine at the time. Okay, so we got Egypt. Okay, we got the locals. The local peoples around here, the other bigger cities down south, they're called Canaanites. Okay, so we got the Egyptians and the Canaanites. We also know this, that there was a group of people came from the northern Mediterranean area called the Sea Peoples. They migrated down and they settled in what's now called the Gaza Strip, Ashdod, Ashkelon, and those places down there south, right? And so they settled there, and some of them actually migrated through here. So that's 3 different peoples you got. And then you got the Israelites, and that's not known anywhere in history except one book. And you know where that book is? That's the Bible. So scholars say, well, it had to be the Egyptians. Well, let's just look at the facts. Let's look at what they actually uncovered. Everything that they've uncovered that's Egyptian here, the cartouches, the statues, the torsos, the statues and stuff, every one of them has been mutilated in some form. Heads cut off, arms cut off, legs cut off. Why would the Egyptians, if they came in and destroyed this, why would they destroy their own cultural things? Somebody answer that. Nobody can answer that. So pretty much you rule out the Egyptians, right? Okay? The Canaanites, the local people. They have found several, out throughout the tale, they have found several temples, Canaanite temples. Every one of them that had a figurine or some sort of goddess that was in that temple, you know what happened? Chopped their heads off. There's one in Area C, there's a little niche that had these hands, had a stele with hands sticking up, and it had a little god figurine sitting there, and it's such a beautiful little statue, and its head is just chiseled off right here. Other Canaanite statues, their hands are cut off. You know why? They're desecrating them, making them powerless. Now let me ask you this. If the Canaanites, the locals, got together as a group and came and destroyed Hatzor, would they destroy their own gods and their own cultures? Eliminates them, right? Okay, so we eliminated Egyptians, we eliminated Canaanites. What about the Sea Peoples? Well, the Sea Peoples are called Sea Peoples for one reason. Do you see the ocean anywhere around here, right? No. So we're too far inland, we're too far north, the Sea Peoples settled south, and they may have come through here on the road, the main road to Damascus came through here, and so they may have came through here, but they weren't interested. It's too far north, too far inland. So who else could be? We had the Egyptians, had the Canaanites, and the Sea Peoples, and who was the next one? The Israelites. Who had a beef against Egypt? Who would have desecrated any kind of Egyptian statue that they would have found? The Canaanite gods, Baal and these other Canaanite gods, Reuben this morning quoted Deuteronomy chapter 6. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is how many? One God. They were monotheistic even in Egypt. So Israel comes here, they see this little temple with the Canaanite gods, and they see these brass figurines. What do? Chop them off, cut that head off. And he asked the question, if logically and physically we see that the Israelites probably did this, why don't we say the Israelites did it? Because somebody has a beef against the Bible. Because that's the only record we have of Hatzor being destroyed by somebody. And so the only reason somebody would say that it was not Israelite is probably because they have a beef against the Bible some way. So the Bible tells us that Joshua came to Hatzor and he destroyed Hatzor and he burned it with fire and he hamstrung their horses. And here you see all the evidence of the destruction. In the palace, the most significant palace of that day, Joshua did it. And I'm convinced of that fact, that Joshua is the one who did that. All right. That concludes my lecture of Hatzor. How about questions you might have of the palace or this region? Yes, ma'am. Why didn't they build what? Because the Israelites controlled it, and they weren't interested much in this north. It was a symbol of the Canaanite city, and they destroyed it, and they cut the serpent's head off, and it just stayed that way. Now, above this layer, what's so interesting as we were coming down to this layer, the people who dwelt here almost looked like nomads. Okay, they didn't have any superstructures. There weren't any big buildings. They had grain place. They would just dig their granaries in the grain holding places in the ground, and they almost were like they were nomadic. And so, what we think is the Israelites, any of them who stayed here, they just covered it up and just left it in ashes, right? Just left it alone. And then the wanderers from around here settled in different places. But when Joshua destroyed it, it was over. Now, later on, Deborah comes up. There's a little group of people, a smaller group. You remember in the book of Judges, Deborah. She comes and destroys Hatzor too. And there's actually two destruction layers here that kind of verify Joshua destruction and Deborah destructions. And so, but after that time period, there was nothing much here. It never regained any significance at all. Yeah. Yeah. I'm sure people lived here, okay? I'm not saying nobody lived here. But they burned it with fire and they destroyed it so thoroughly and chased all the people off. And then by the time Deborah and Judges came up here, that it never regained any major significance. It probably dwindled as a town and kind of lingered around, but it was never, ever like it was back in the days before Joshua, ever. Yep. Yeah, it became more of a fortress up here. Solomon fortified it later on in the Israelite period, and he built the casement wall. And there were some buildings and stuff. It just never had the significance, I guess, And so I don't think the lower tail was ever redone. This upper tail, and even Solomon's fortification of it was only like half of this upper tail area. And so he just made a fort out of the upper tail area. But we're talking from the time of Joshua to the time of Solomon, at a minimum 200 years. And so a lot of stuff happens, and so, and then after Solomon's period, there were some things happen here, but it just never was a city of any prominence whatsoever.
This represents the latest level that exists.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just curious, in as much as archaeology is a destructive enterprise, I'm sure that there's some other ancient Near Eastern archaeologists that'd be interested in knowing what's below this.
Yeah.
Is there any conversation about?
No, I don't think they would dig this up to show anything. Now, there's going to be some digging. This is an ongoing dig. They dig at Hatzor, have been digging since 1990, I believe, every year. And so there'll be some diggers here probably later on, unless something's happened, I don't know. But when you go into the money and effort to build this kind of shed, you're not going to tear it up. You're not. This is it. And so they're satisfied. This is a Canaanite palace, existed no telling how long before Joshua came, and it's so significant and so big, they said, we're going to leave this. And so they're not going below it. They've gone below it in other areas outside of this, but this palace is going to stay here. Yeah. And so, you think about in asking the question, did it ever recover? In Solomon's day, this was all underground at that time. They had already covered it over with ground, with dirt and stuff. And so Solomon didn't even come down to this level. The level of the dirt was here. That makes sense, okay? And so when the archaeologists came here, they'd been digging since way up here coming down this way. And when they got here, this palace was so significant with the podium out there and the big basalt columns, bases. And if you can just imagine the walls built up to this height, and how elaborate it is. And then you come in these two big pillars. You had to walk in here, and then there's a little podium out there, probably a sacrificial podium of some sort. And right here, there's a little niche. You can see there's a stone there. It has two indentions and probably had a statue there. And that's one of those indentions in that rock, some sort of statue there. So this was something of a magnificent palace. I mean, it was just incredible up here. So it's not going anywhere, Robert. They're not going to. They'll extrapolate things from around here to this area, but this area is going to be here, I think.